Hello, this is Jay Rogers of the Forerunner.com and Forerunner TV on YouTube. And what I would like to let you know is that you can always go to our website. And this is our website right here, Forerunner.com. And we have a donate button. And you can also subscribe to our videos and like our videos to help us. Last time that I talked about the Russia-Ukraine war was in 4 months ago, which would have been early December, so January, February, March, April, and roughly 4 months ago. This was the video that I did. It was called Russia-Ukraine, What Will Happen in 2023. I wanted to come back now and tell you what I would think is happening now. I said at the very end of that video that I would come back in a few months and I would describe what has happened since then. So this is the map as it looks now. And the first thing I want to do is I want to discuss the war map and some of the things that have happened since then. So one of the things that we can do here is we can actually back up to December. And I want to look mainly at Donbass, because Donbass is where mainly the fighting has been taking place since early December. So I'm going to back up all the way to December 7th. Okay. And I will click on this. And we're going to zoom in on Donbass and look at what it looked like back then. Okay, this is Slavyansk, Kramatorsk. And what happened at that point was the Russians were advancing toward Donbass, but they were making very slow progress. So, and you don't actually see Donbass unless you zoom in on the map here. So let's go there. Okay, this is Donetsk City, and as you go north, you find Bakhmut. Okay, so they were encroaching on Bakhmut. Now let me explain what is going on with this map. If you look at the dark red area or this purplish area, this was the administrative line prior to the war. And the war has had basically three phases. The first phase, Russia invaded from the north, the east, and the south. They were most successful in the south, and they captured this land corridor plus this area of Kherson into Mykolaiv. They were less successful in Kiev, where they came south. And some of the maps at that time were a little bit deceiving, because they mainly controlled the roads, like a road north-south from Kiev and some towns, roads into Sumy and another town called Chernihiv. And my opinion about those fronts were that the Russians attacked from all points. And what they believed was that when the West and the Ukrainian government saw that they were serious about their goals in securing peace in Donbass and getting Ukraine to agree to non-NATO status, that they would have come to the negotiating table and they would have said, okay, stop, let's have a ceasefire and let's negotiate. And for a time that was happening. They were negotiating even up until March, and into April, Ukraine called it off. And at that time, they were willing to agree to non-NATO status, and the sticking point was recognition of Crimea, but they did agree to recognize this area of Ukraine as Ukraine, but having, this would be Donbass, part of Lugansk and part of Donetsk. And what they agreed to is that these areas would have autonomy, meaning that they could vote for their own governors, they could run their own schools, they could have their own police force, just like a state does in the United States. All the other regions of Ukraine have governors that are appointed. So it's not really a democracy from a top up with a bicameral separation of powers. I don't want to get into that right now, but Ukraine is not a democracy like America, where people rule themselves on a local level. So these Russian speakers here had broken away in 2014, and there had been some agreements saying that they could be autonomous, but that hadn't happened. And there's different reasons why it hadn't happened. Ukraine blames Russia, Russia blames Ukraine, and so on. But they were very close to getting an agreement. And then that was nixed by the West. Biden, Boris Johnson, and so on, they told Vladimir Zelensky that you cannot agree to give up Crimea, first of all, and you cannot also agree to give them status. I'm going to talk at the end about, why that off-ramp was not available to them. Okay. So that was the first phase of the war. The second phase was Russia withdrew from Kiev. People say they retreated, but it was actually a tactical retreat. And they focused their efforts on Donbass. And they started to make some gains. Okay. The second phase of the war happened after the Kherson front and the Kharkiv front collapsed. First it was Kharkiv and then Kherson. There was an attempted counteroffensive in Kherson. It failed. The Ukrainians turned to Kharkiv, and that was successful. The Russians retreated back to this line here. This is the borderline of the Lugansk Republic. And then what Russia did at that point was they said, we're going to mobilize, or in other words, we're going to more than double our size of the troops that are in Ukraine, and we're going to recognize these four regions, Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, or Zaporozhia, as the Russians say, and Kherson, as actual republics of Russia. So they absorbed them into Russia. Now the first negotiating points are off the table. Russia still wanted non-NATO status for Ukraine, but now they're saying that these 5 oblasts, including Sevastopol, are no longer oblasts of Ukraine, but that they are part of Russia, even including this line out here that I'm tracing, which Russia does not occupy right now. So in order for the war to be over now, Russia will have had to have taken these regions, or Ukraine will have to driven them out of those regions entirely. So we're kind of stuck in a stalemate. Okay. Stage 3 of the war has been going on since the mobilization, and that was probably January, February, and what we have seen. So that was where I left off. Stage 3 basically has started a few months ago, and it's basically Russia's attempt now to push all the way out and take all of Donbass. Okay, so what's been going on with that? I'm just going to play this, and I want you to look at very carefully the city of Bakhmut right here, and then this northern city of Soledar. Okay, so if you believe that Vladimir Putin wants to take over all of Ukraine and, then take, Poland, the Baltic states, parts of Europe, and basically expand the Soviet Empire, the Russian Empire again, then he's obviously losing. They're not doing that. But Putin's stated goal from the very beginning of the war was to secure Donbass and demilitarize Ukraine. So their strategy right now, if you look at these arrows, is that what the Russians do is they fight along this line. And back in the time of 2014, the Ukrainians very strongly fortified these lines. They, these are in, if you go anywhere in Donbass, every few miles there's a town or a city. Every few kilometers you see a little town or city. And there are these entrenched areas. They actually have trenches dug. The cities are fortifications in themselves, because in Soviet era times they had fallout shelters, and they used the basements and the strong buildings of these cities as fortifications. So it's very difficult for Russia to simply just take them over. What they have to do is they have to send out these salients like this, and they punch through weak areas in the lines, and they draw the fire of the Ukrainians. And then what they do is they send out another salient, and they get the Ukrainians caught in these cauldrons, and then they're able to fire from many directions, 2 or 3 directions, 4 directions, and then they drive them out. And many Ukrainian soldiers are lost that way. So you see how they took Krasnogora and the other city called Soledar, okay, which is up here. And the current situation is that they're moving on Bakhmut. Now, if you look at any Western sources, they'll tell you that the Russians are failing in Bakhmut, that they haven't been able to take the city. In reality, as of today, they've taken about 90% of the city, and they're doing clearing operations. But it's the same strategy. It's the Russians are day by day, taking block by block of territory. And the goal is not to take territory, but it's to grind down the Ukrainian forces so that they go from, a force of like 200,000 down to 150,000, down to 100,000. And then when they're at about half strength, the Ukrainian army will crumble and they'll have to come to the negotiating table. You can't win a war without an army. Okay, so this is what's happened even in Bakhmut in the last couple of days. It's very dramatic. You can see that they've just moved on the city. Now, why is Bakhmut important? Bakhmut is a major hub, and this is where the Ukrainians were most strongly fortified, and has been so far the most difficult city to take, even including Mariupol, which was also difficult. So this is, as of today, this is April 12th, and this is, this map is a little bit outdated. The Russian forces are somewhere in this gray zone. They've actually crossed these railroad tracks now. And if you look at the entire city of Bakhmut, if you look at everything that's outside the gray zone, that's about all this area. In geography, that's about 85-90% of Bakhmut, and there's about 10-15% left. And what's happening now is that the Ukrainians are just sending in forces to Bakhmut, or the forces that are there are fighting, and they're not trying to withdraw. So at this time of the year, yes, the Russians could march out to Chasny Yar or Slovyansk or this other city called Seversk. There's Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, and Seversk. Those are the three other linchpins that they would have to take, including Avdiivka. And they would pretty much, once they get those three, they pretty much have Donbass, because the lines go along these areas. The strongest fortifications were the front lines. Once they get past Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar, Avdiivka, then pretty much the front lines are broken, and the next thing would be to move on to these other cities like Seversk, Slovyansk, Kramatorsk. There are others along here. Those are also strongly fortified, but not as fortified as Bakhmut. So the idea is that if they were able to get that, all of Bakhmut, let's say by the summer, and I say the summer because it's not advantageous for the Russians to just now march across open ground. Number one, because it's mud season, and number two, because when they're outside the fortifications, it's very easy to pick tanks off, to pick troops off, and so on. So they would lose a lot of troops by a frontal assault. And like I said, what they do instead is they send out salients in the fortified areas. Like you can see that happening all along here. These are little attempts. See, there's a fortification there. If you zoom in on this in Google Earth, you can see that along the roads and in these mining areas, there are all these fortifications. So what they do is they send a salient there, a salient there. They get the Ukrainians to attack them, and then send in more troops. And then as they're attacking in this direction, they eliminate troops. They send in more troops through these roads. And then what they will do is they will widen this salient out here, and then this one out here, and then they surround them and they grind them down. And that's being done all over the battle line. And they only take areas that are fortified. So like, for instance, this would be the next area, this city in here, which I don't know the name of, Turetsk, I guess it is, which hasn't really shown up in the news at all. And then especially here, Avdiivka, you see that's what they're doing. They're not attacking Avdiivka directly because they have to move across fields and they get picked off. And this is heavily entrenched. Instead, what they're doing is that they're getting troops to come in, and they're trying to cut off these roads. Okay, so that's the whole Russian objective at this point. The object of the war is to demilitarize Ukraine. It's to grind Ukraine down, and to the point where they don't have a military anymore that can fight. Okay, what is Ukraine's objective? Well, it depends on who you talk to. The government of Kiev says it's to drive Russia out of all the territories and to take Crimea. And even people in the West that are funding Ukraine doubt that that's possible. What they want to do is inflict losses on Russia and weaken Russia. Why? We don't really know. I have my own idea, which I'll share at the end here. If we look at this map here, this is the deployment map for military land. And you see that this is the same thing. The only difference about this map is it shows the Ukrainian deployment too. Okay, so in order to talk about who's winning, we need to talk about casualties. And I know that what the West says is that Russia's losing, that there's many more Russians being killed, that there's something like, 100,000, 200,000 Russians killed, and that Ukraine has lost like almost no one. All right. Now that was contradicted by a leak recently. Now I'm going to get to that, but there was a leak that said that actually the Russian casualties are much lower than the Ukrainian casualties. And Ukraine does not give accurate numbers. Like if you see here, let's talk about civilian casualties first. The Ukrainian government says there's anywhere from 9,000, which is a round number, to 16,502, which is a specific number. So which is it? The Norwegian chief of defense says that there were 30,000 civilians killed. The United Nations estimates that there are 8,490 confirmed minimum killed, but thought higher, and then 14,244 wounded. Okay, I trust this number, and I agree with them that it's higher because they just haven't found all of the wounded and killed. Is it twice as high? I doubt that, but it's higher. It's not this number here. The Ukrainian war crimes prosecutor has said that Russia has killed 100,000 civilians. So what happens is that whenever we hear anything from Ukraine, they put out these very large, almost clownish numbers that are just unbelievable. And what the U.S. and the United Nations and other Western estimates have to do is they have to use those and come up with their own ideas. How many Ukrainians have died in the war? Well, the U.S. documentation says 17,500 and up to 130,000 casualties. So this is a pretty good ratio because what I read was that there are usually 2.8 casualties per death. All right. So in other words, if there were 131,000 casualties, what you would do is you would divide 131 by 2.8. And this is the basic number. Like for every person killed in the battlefield, there's a person that's wounded. Some people are catastrophically wounded, like they lose their arms and legs. They'll never live a normal life again. Other people are wounded so badly they can't return to fight, but within a year or two they might resume a normal life. And other people might like get hit with shrapnel or some type of other injury, and they can be patched up, and within a few weeks or a few months they could either return to active duty or not. So if we take 131 and divide it by 2.8, the number that we get is about 46, say around 50,000. So 50,000 Ukrainians killed, I think, is probably an accurate number. It might be a little bit higher than that, but I think that's an accurate number. Of course, the Ukrainians, let's see. So we have 120 killed and wounded, 150 killed and wounded, and no matter how you crunch that down, this is all similar to this number. So if we go with the number of about 50,000 Ukrainians killed and then 2.8 higher, that's probably accurate. Okay. The Ukrainian government says that there's only 13,000 of their soldiers killed, and then they estimate that the number of Russian soldiers that have been killed are 176,000. And again, that is clownish to say that the Russian casualties are 10 times as large. And I'm going to show you how that's impossible as we go along here. And then you have Western sources play with these numbers, and they say, okay, it's not 200,000. Notice here it says 40 to 60,000 killed. So if we take that middle number, 50,000, that would be about equal to the Ukrainian casualties, right? So, long story short, there's actually no way of knowing if you look at Western sources. But what we got recently was a leak, okay? And the leak said, see if I can find this. That's not it. That's not it. This is what the leak said. Total assessed losses. There was a leak from the Pentagon in the form of a memo, and they said that there were 16,000 to 17,000 Russian casualties and 71,000 Ukrainian casualties. Now, I'm guessing what this means is that the 16 to 17,000 Russian casualties are Russians killed, because they can always replace them. And the 71,000 Ukrainian casualties are killed plus wounded, who are people that they cannot replace. And the reason why the Ukrainians cannot replace their casualties is that they have fewer troops in reserve that the Russians do. So, like, in other words, these people are never coming back, but they can be replaced. These people are never coming back, but they can be replaced. These people are never coming back, but they can't be replaced. All right, so this is the reason. Casualties can either mean killed or it can mean killed and wounded. So I think that the Russian figure is correct for killed, and I think the Ukrainian casualty rate is correct too. But it's actually more like 50,000. Okay, and then if we add up, the 2.8 figure, you get to 150. And if you add it up, if you put 2.8, let's see, if we put 2.8 times 17, that's not right. It's going to be about 50,000. So this is what I believe, okay? And again, no one knows what's true exactly. No one knows, because look at this. I mean, there's no agreement. And we also have to take into account, this is one that says 35,000 Russian soldiers killed plus 122,000 wounded. And that's much higher than the 2.8. So these are all guesstimates. Everything says estimate, estimate, estimate. Here's documentation, which is also an estimate. But I think that let's do a round number and say that Russia has lost about 18,000. Okay, and multiply that by the number that we were talking about. So it's 18,000, and then we'd say times 2.8. And what we would end up with would be, oops. Say 50,000. We're going to round off because, like I said, no one really knows. Okay. So 50,000 plus 18,000, 68,000 Russian casualties. Okay. I think that this number is, I don't know what this number is. I don't know if that's killed, but I'm going to go with a number that's about, it's not quite 3 times as high, but it's between 2 and 3 times as high. So 3 times 18 would be 54,000. I'm going to say that there have been about 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed, and then times 2.8. $140,000. Okay. So whenever you hear, I don't know if you say 140. So plus 140, that would be casualties. Oops. 190,000. So if you're a fan of like, Colonel Douglas McGregor or Scott Ritter, this is the number they'll cite. They'll say 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. Well, no, it's casualties plus, and I think that is accurate. I think that there are about close to 200,000 Ukrainians that have lost their lives or have been taken out of the battlefield. Now, some of these, maybe like 25%, are going to be able to come back, but for the time being, they're lost. Okay, so 190,000. This now it's significant because this is what they started the war with, was 200,000 soldiers that were deployed. Okay, and then I think that out of the 180,000 soldiers that the Russians started with, that they've lost more than 1/3 of their force. Okay, so that's significant. The Ukraine lost all its army, its first deployment, and Russia lost 1/3 of it. Okay, now why do I think that this is close to a 3-to-1? Okay, I'm hearing people like McGregor and Ritter say it's 7-to-1. I don't believe that. I think that this is the number for killed, which is about just over 3-to-1, and this is just over 3-to-1 as well. Something like that. Around 3. They're both casualties plus deaths are around 3-to-1. Deaths between the two armies are about 3-to-1, with Russia on the low side and Ukraine on the high side. Now let's look at what this was the report. It said 16,000 to 71,000. If you multiply that by 3, no, it's much higher than that. Okay, but let's look at why do I think the Russians are winning? Let's look at that. Why do I think the Russians are winning? I'm just going to get rid of this. Okay, this is document 4. Okay, there was this leak. All right, the Pentagon leaks all the time, but there was a leak, and there were several papers that came out. This is actually what the papers look like. Okay, these are the leak pages that came out of the Pentagon. You may have seen these. And there's different statistics that are given on the Ukraine war. There's actually many, many of these. These are just 4 of them. But these are actual papers by the Pentagon, and they give numbers like the total number of Russian troops, the total number of Ukrainian troops, and everything like that. And that this is what they say. Okay, and people have their doubts as to whether it's accurate or not. But these were definite leaks. Like, the U.S. government is not denying that these were leaks. Okay. What I want to show you here is a map that I saw recently about troop numbers. If you remember back in 2022 when the war started, it was said that Ukraine had about 180,000 to 200,000 troops on the field all over Ukraine deployed, and that Russia had about an equal amount. Okay. As it is today, there are 80,000 troops that are committed to relieving the troops in Bakhmut. Okay, so in other words, there's diminished strength in there's diminished strength in Avdiivka, and so they want to move about 80,000 troops into this area. Okay, and these are 80,000 troops all along the line, from the top all the way to the bottom. Okay, and some of the troops are redirected towards Avdiivka, and some of the troops are going to be directed toward Bakhmut. And this is supposedly a counteroffensive that's coming up. There are also 40,000 troops that are spread along this line here, along the very eastern portion of Donetsk, which is Mariupol, and the Zaporizhia line. They're saying that there'll be also another offensive, a spring offensive, in 2023. And they will be Some units are already directed towards Bakhmut, but let's say maybe 30,000 are going to attack Zaporizhzhia. So you say, how can they do that if Russia has 50,000 troops? Well, supposedly that there's another 80,000 troops that are throughout Ukraine, and so you have 80,000 plus 80,000. Oops, I'm jumping ahead here. 80,000 plus 80,000 is 160 plus 40 is 200,000. So that adds up. That is like the total strength of Ukrainian troops. Russia had, from its deployment in the last time they had their, let's say that Russia had originally 200,000 troops, and let's say that they lost that huge number, like 1/3 of their troops, and they're down now to, let's say they're down all the way to 100,000. Well, they activated 300,000 in a call-up, which was called mobilization, partial mobilization, plus another 80,000 that volunteered. So minimum right now, Russia has 480,000 troops that could be deployed, that are scheduled to be deployed in Ukraine. But as of right now, it has 130 plus 60 plus 50 plus 50. So in other words, 290. Okay. So 290, 480. There's still about 190 that are either in. I'll show you what this looks like on the map. They're in Belarus, they're in Russia, they're in Crimea, they're in the Black Sea, they're in different places. There are troops that are committed to the battle, but they're outside of the range. In the same way, Ukraine has these 80,000 along this line. Okay. Oops. But they have 40,000 that are committed to defending this line, and then another 80,000 spread throughout Ukraine. So that's 200,000. So 200,000 versus 480,000. Why is Russia winning? Because they have more troops. All right, let's look at this over here. This is from a website which is called Statista, and Statista is pretty good. It tells you where the statistics come from, and this is the total number of personnel that they say that Russia has as of 2023. Estimated total military personnel: 1.3 million active soldiers, 830 reserve paratroopers, and so on. Now, Russia does not have 830,000 soldiers in Ukraine. They have active soldiers elsewhere, and about 490,000 are either in Ukraine or on the border. How many total military personnel does Ukraine have? Okay, 500,000, and active within Ukraine 200,000, which is the number I just gave you. Okay, so this seems like it's accurate. Let's look at total aircraft. 4,000 to 300 helicopters. Okay, now I want to emphasize this is not pro-Russian at all. This is just kind of like unbiased estimates of what type of firepower that Russia has versus Ukraine. Helicopters, 15,000 to 100. Fighter jets, 700 to 69, and so on. Armored vehicles, okay. Tank strength. So Ukraine has lost some tanks, but they have 2,000 tanks. How many tanks does Russia have? Okay, now not all of these tanks are mobilized. Some tanks are being repaired, some tanks are lost, and so on. But you see, this is 6 to 1. Okay. In every single category you look down, it's 4-1, 10-1, you know, ridiculous amounts here. So one of the things that you'll see in the media, in the pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian media, is that Russia has been losing a lot of, they've been losing a lot of hardware and so on. Okay, this goes on. This is the big one right here. 6,000 nuclear warheads to 0. So this is a war that Russia, if it wants to win it, it's going to win it. That's how that's going to work. Let's look at a couple of other things before I move on here. Okay, we talked about the leak already. Ukraine is firing 6,000 to 7,000 artillery shells per day. U.S. firms produce 15,000 a month. So at a certain point, Ukraine runs out of shells, and some people have estimated June 1st. So they were advised to cut down to 3,000 shells a day, which they did. And when Ukraine cut down to 3,000 shells per day, Russia cut down for a while to 10 to 15. Now they're back up to 20,000 again. So, imagine this, 20,000 shells per day versus 7,000. All right. This is the reason why when people say that the body count, the casualty rate for Russia is much higher than Ukraine, it just doesn't make sense. Because from the beginning of the war, this is what they're firing versus this is what Russia is firing. And I already explained on the map what the type of warfare it is. Okay. As far as tanks goes, a lot of people say, well, Russia's going to run out of tanks, and they're using old tanks, and we're sending them new tanks. Therefore, Russia has the disadvantage because they're going to run out all of their tanks. So this is what the Kyiv Independent, they're from Kyiv, they're pro-Ukrainian. This is a Ukrainian newspaper. All right, they say, as the Ukrainian military center suggests, those T-62s could be in better shape than many stored T-72s or T-80s. What they're saying is that Russia has some older tanks, but they could actually be in better shape than the more recent tanks. In other words, like these were mothballed, but these were being used. And that is probably the reason why Russia decided to quickly demothball them and send them to Ukraine. One of the things that people were saying is, look, Russia is running out of tanks because they're using these old tanks. Well, they use the old tanks first. What they have left are the more modern tanks. Okay? And it says, Russia has at least 2,000 potentially restorable tanks, meaning it will not run out during this war in Ukraine, even if it has to roll back its relics from the early 1960s. Forbes magazine, a very pro-Ukrainian magazine, wrote 2 or 3 years. That's how long the Russian army might have before it runs out of tanks, according to one estimate. And the other thing you have to understand, that Russia is manufacturing like about a tank a day or so. So they're manufacturing 20 to 30 tanks, and we've promised to send Ukraine less than 100 tanks. So literally in 3 months, 3 or 4 months, Russia could have more tanks off the assembly line than what we've promised Ukraine for the next year. All right, so there's that. Okay, so who's winning? My prognosis is Russia's winning. There's supposedly this offensive that's coming. What we found out through these Pentagon leaks is that Ukraine does not have the forces. It kind of confirms this. They do not have the forces to have a successful counteroffensive. They might still do it, but if they still do it, what will happen is that they'll continue to lose troops at a 3-to-1 ratio or higher. Okay, so why are our leaders lying? The simple reason why they're lying is because they don't have an off-ramp. Okay? And not having an off-ramp is very serious because let's say the United States were to say, okay, we're going to give Russia what it wants. You can have these occupied territories. We'll do some type of a demilitarized zone in eastern Ukraine so that in a security agreement, we'll pledge for non-NATO status and so on. That would be a common sense thing to do at this point to stop the war. Okay. It doesn't actually well, I'm going to get to this in a minute, but my plan would not actually require Ukraine to give up anything. They just couldn't keep fighting. In other words, they don't have to recognize these regions, just stop it. Just stop it. It's the same way that the same thing happened in North and South Korea, happened with the Baltic states. You have territories that aren't really recognized by either side. North Korea doesn't recognize that South Korea is a legitimate republic. South Korea doesn't recognize North Korea. We don't recognize North Korea either. But we drew a line and said we're not going to fight anymore, and we haven't. Okay, that's the way it goes in world politics. In the Baltic states, they became absorbed into the Soviet Union, and we agreed that they could be part of the Warsaw Pact, but not part of the Soviet Union. And we never recognized the Baltic states as part of the Soviet Union, but they were. Okay, so let's go to why I think our leaders are lying about the war. Okay. The reason why they're lying is because they realize that their original plan. Let's see if I can pull up these maps real quick. Okay. If you look at these maps, the first thing you're going to notice is that as far as protecting ethnic Russians, Russia has pretty much achieved their goal. Okay. These are the areas where there are a lot of ethnic Russians. Okay. Lugansk, Donbass, Lugansk and Donetsk, which is Donbass region. This is Zaporizhia. This is Kherson. This whole region is Kherson up to here. And then we have this other region. Which is a pretty high percentage too. But if they stopped fighting today, they would have protected the vast majority of the of Russians in Russia. That's the goal. The other thing is to demilitarize. So what you would say is that you can't have military troops. You have to draw a line somewhere. Either it could be here, it could be along here or somewhere. You can't have troops that are going to fire into our Russian-speaking territory. Okay? And this is another map that kind of bears this out. This is the line right now. Okay. Majority language by city and town. All right. So that's the way that is. This is another map, pretty much says the same thing. I mean, it's interesting. There's slightly different ways of looking at it. This would be mixed language, where some people speak Russian only. And this is incorrect because there are people in this area who speak Russian as well. But this is the area where there's a large percentage of Russian speakers. Okay. Even into Moldova and so on. All right. This is a historical map of Ukraine. It pretty much follows that same, up until 1954, this area was Russian. Up until 1922, this area was Russia, and so on. This area here was part of Poland, Romania, and Hungary, and so on. Okay. The plan was originally to do to Russia what happened to the Soviet Union, especially these two regions here, the Ural region and the Siberian region. The plan was to get ethnic conflicts going in places like Tatarstan and these little ethnic republics, maybe in the Ural Mountains and Karelia along the Finnish border. That's the reason, by the way, for Finland's accession to NATO, is they want to start something along the border, and basically break Russia up into. Break Russia up into separate territories, so that the United States could control basically Exxon and Mobil and these other countries would move in, and they would mine the natural gas and the oil in these regions like we do through Middle East contracts. If the Russians weren't going to do it through contracts, then we would basically make these regions split off, And so you would have like the Republic of Ural, the Republic of Siberia, the Republic of Tatarstan, and we would begin to make contracts with their companies. So we started that with Georgia and Chechnya to try to break up Russia, try to get these ethnic conflicts going. And then after Russia's broken up, it's weakened, move on to China. This is the reason why our leaders don't want an off-ramp. Okay, it's actually very simple. This is a war that they actually wanted. Okay, it's not. This is not a war that happened accidentally. It's a war that basically was brought about because of the ambitions of the West. We would like the whole world to be part of one world order and control the world through one economic system, and that's all falling apart right now. So is there an off-ramp or not? Okay, this would be my plan. Now, I said the original one was to basically make Ukraine non-NATO and neutral, to implement the Minsk agreements, like make Lugansk and Donetsk to be autonomous republics. That is, they would be part of Ukraine, but not controlled by Kiev that much. And recognize Crimea was another one, and a security agreement directly with Europe was another one. But that never happened. That was on the table all the way up until April. And then even after that, when Kiev rejected it, it could have happened all the way up into September, when Russia actually annexed, or these regions acceded to Russia. So this is where it could stand now. This is how I would solve the crisis today. And if this doesn't happen, I'll actually be surprised, because this is the only thing I think is a possible solution. Okay. Ukraine would be partitioned into different zones. And like I said, Ukraine does not have to officially give up anything, but there would be partitioning. Eastern and southeastern Ukraine, or historic New Russia, would be Region 1. Neutralized non-NATO central Ukraine. And then there would be Western Ukraine, held by peacekeepers from Poland and other countries, maybe Romania, Hungary, Israel, etc. In other words, like countries that have a vested interest in Ukraine, that are either neighbors or they're, people that have ethnic people living within Ukraine. Like there are a lot of Polish and Romanian and Hungarians and Jews in Ukraine. So there would be peacekeepers in Western Ukraine, just making sure that there aren't militias and terrorist groups that are getting started there. So a very simple solution to the problem could be had if Russia and a new Kyiv government would ditch the liberal nation state world order and move toward an original civilization state model. That means that a nation is not defined by geopolitics, but by its historic civilization. In this worldview and philosophy, there's more than a political system. This is how the whole world ran up until the late 1600s. And people would need to be re-educated out of liberal ideas to achieve this, but it's already happening. So I think that this is a possible solution for the time being. All right, Donbass and Crimea, or portions of Donbass, could be ceded to Russia. Kyiv could choose to recognize them or not. Russia would have a limited number of troops in place for security with other observers to watch for human rights violations toward ethnic Ukrainians. Possibly Chinese and Turkish peacekeepers could be in Donbass and in Crimea. And I don't think that there's going to be a problem between Russians and Ukrainians after this. I think that there's going to be a problem between Ukrainians and Russians. In other words, there's not going to be a problem in the East with Russians not allowing Ukrainians to have rights. It's going to be the other way around. By treaty, Russia would recognize the national sovereignty of central and western Ukraine as a demilitarized, non-NATO neutral country by constitutional law. And they would have to vote on that. They would have to change the constitution. Peace and security would be guaranteed under the UN's international law. Not the Western rules-based order, but the actual laws of the UN Charter. Kyiv would not have to recognize Crimea or Donbass. However, Kyiv must recognize the autonomy of those regions in addition to Zaporizhia and Kherson. I'm not sure if I spelled that right, but something like that. In other words, the southern parts would be autonomous. People in the gray area, like these autonomous regions, would have dual citizenship, but the four oblasts would rule themselves and have the right to self-determination. All right, and as I said, that might seem impossible, but that was the status of the Baltic states and so on. We never recognized the Baltic states as part of the USSR, but everyone knew they were part of it. Russia also has autonomous regions and oblasts with governors. So Russia has autonomous regions in which they vote for their governor or president, like Chechnya and Tatarstan. And they also have oblasts like Ukraine with governors appointed by Moscow. So this model actually already exists in Russia. It could exist in Ukraine as well. And I would also say there would have to never be any visa requirements for Russians and Ukrainians passing freely between these regions and even into each other's countries to work. There should be a unification between Russia and Ukraine that's not political, but it is national. In other words, if your nationality is Ukrainian or Russian, you can still work in either region. Okay. And I would even extend that to Russia. There's many Ukrainians living in Russia, and there used to be a time when they could pass freely back and forth prior to the war. Just like we don't need a visa to travel to Europe and so on. In Western Ukraine, for a time period, there would be peace, at least for a time period. I'm not saying forever, but for 10 years, something like that. There would be peacekeeping troops guaranteeing the security of Central and Western Ukraine. They should be from Poland, Hungary, and Romania, but also Israel, Turkey, and China could be among them. Okay, I should say could instead of would. And the reason why is because these are countries that are friendly to both Russia and Ukraine. Turkey and China would be preferred investors in the Ukrainian economy because they have money. And they would also have a vested interest in keeping peace among the ethnic minorities in Western Ukraine, namely the Hungarians, Romanians, Jews, and Polish. Central Ukraine must remain demilitarized. All Nazi political parties or parties emphasizing racism or ethnocentrism would be banned in all regions of Ukraine. Nazi slogans and symbols would be outlawed. So they'd have to tear down the statue of Stepan Bandera, the Nazi hero of Ukraine, the Nazi hero of Ukraine in Lviv. They'd have to tear down that statue. Nationalist militia groups would also be illegal in all regions, east, central, and west. And that's just common sense. It's true in Germany. It should be true in Ukraine too. The Nazis killed, all these people, 27 million Russians, millions of Jews, Romanians, Gypsies, and so on. Poles especially too. And this is one thing people don't realize when we talk about Nazi Ukraine. People say, oh, well, Zelensky is a Jew. How can you call him a Nazi? That's ludicrous. Well, our press recognized that Ukraine had a Nazi problem up until the war started. It was just a fact. And for a Russian, the Jews lost 6.5 million people to the Nazis. The Russians lost 27 million. But we never talk about that. We talk about Jews, Poles, Gypsies. Sometimes we talk about the Slavs, but not Russian Slavs. We just call them Slavs, like Yugoslavians. We also talk about homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so on. But we never mention the largest ethnic group that was killed by the Nazis in the largest numbers, which was the Russians with 27 million. Number 6, everything would be done under a revised UN framework, emphasizing international laws, recent documents out of China and Russia have outlined, and ditching the unfair liberal rules-based order of the West, which in favor of the multipolar civilization state model. So in other words, rather than having the West dictate the rules, this is what the rules-based order is that we'll dictate the rules with our G7 group, and everyone else will follow them. And we ditch that, the unipolar world, which is led by the United States and the collective West, in favor of multipolar civilizational model. And that would be an understood structure with all the parties involved, including Ukraine, Russia, China, Turkey, and so on. Ultimately, the goal would be to move toward an East Slavic, one civilization, multiple systems model. In other words, we're one people, but we can have multiple governments. Belarus, Ukraine, if Western Ukraine wanted to split off and start its own republic with Poland, that would be fine. So one civilization, multiple systems, with a gradual de-emphasis on its political systems in favor of local autonomy of regions as soon as the family, religious, and cultural institutions are strengthened morally and are able to become self-governing. And that's the biggest problem I saw when I was in Russia and Ukraine. It's not that they didn't have a good constitution or the right idea or that they were still communists. They just didn't have strong families. It's a high divorce rate, high alcoholism rate. Russian Orthodox Church was fairly weak at that time. It's gotten better. But still the people are, they're not they're culturally Christian now more than before, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And there needs to be lots of cultural institutions established. Like one of the things that Putin was talking about in Donbass was opening a lot of museums, to educate people about, what does it mean to be part of this civilization. So essentially what I describe above is a central and western Ukraine as a little Russia or a client state of Russia like Belarus. And the problem of Western nationalism could be solved by partitioning, keeping peacekeeping troops, and then the other legal points I outlined. It's a temporary solution with a long-term outlook. So it works for a temporary period of time, but then long-term it also works too. Western Ukraine might opt for EU membership, or all of Ukraine might be in the EU and the East Asian Economic Union, which is Russia's alliance with like Belarus, Kazakhstan, and so on. I don't know all the nations, but there's several that are part of this, and they're trying to expand it too. Many nations are members of more than one economic alliance, which is true. There's nations in South America, for instance, which are part of an economic alliance with the West, with the United States, but then they've also applied for or are part of BRICS. Brazil is part of BRICS and other nations, so you can do that. It's not unheard of either. Many nations are part of more than one economic alliances. That is, if the EU continues to exist. It's not a definite future possibility. It's not definite for the future that the EU will even exist like the way it looks now. Okay, that's my video. Thanks for watching. Like I said, like and subscribe. I tried to cover a lot of ground in this one. And hopefully I'll be able to do more in the near future.